It's great to see everyone here this evening, and you pushed your way through this insufferable heat to be with us tonight, so we especially appreciate that. I'm Tom Payton. I'm the director and publisher at Trinity University Press, and we're delighted to see everyone here this evening. At Trinity, we... I'm supposed to be in the spot. Sorry. I was pushing back. I'm not used to it. I'm not pro like these guys, pulling back from these lines. At Trinity, we publish about 20 books a year under several imprints, but notably, one of our imprints is Maverick Books, which is all dedicated to books about Texas with keen interest in our own backyard. So especially books about San Antonio and South Central Texas increasingly. And that grew out of a move we made in 2014 when we purchased Maverick Publishing Company, which was at the time owned by Lewis and Mary Maverick Fisher, and used that transaction as a way to deepen our commitment to Texas and build upon it. And to continue that legacy, we created Maverick Books as that imprint. And then years later, we started a group called the Maverick Book Club, where we would meet 4 times a year to discuss one of those books. That went virtual during COVID, of course. And then coming out of COVID and returning to in-person events, we had a wonderful discussion with our friends here at Texas Public Radio and decided to collaborate and partner starting in January of this year. And it's been so much fun seeing this evolve. This is our 3rd in this series. And we're doing 4 events together, co-produced by Texas Public Radio and Trinity University Press. So thank you for being here to be a part of that. And thank you by extension for supporting the mission of both organizations by being here this evening. So why we're really here. I can go through some formalities, but I have a hunch at least a good many of you all know or know of who we're here to see this evening. We are delighted to have just published this new book, Native Texan, Stories from Deep in the Heart by Joe Holley. Took us a little while to get it across the finish line, and we appreciate Joe's patience, but I am so glad that it's here. And I'm gonna do the formalities and then loop back to our discussion here this evening. Joe has been the Native Texan columnist for the Houston Chronicle since 2013 and an editorial writer for the paper since 2012. A Native Texan himself from Waco, he has also been the editorial page editor at the San Diego, California, and a contributor to Texas Monthly, speechwriter for Governor Ann Richards, and a staff writer for the Washington Post. He was a Pulitzer Prize finalist in 2017 and 2023, and a 2022 Pulitzer Prize winner as part of the Houston Chronicle team that produced a series of editorials debunking the big lie about voter fraud and concerning or examining Texas's long history of voter suppression. He's the author of 7 books, including Hometown Texas, published by Trinity University Press, Hurricane Season, and Sutherland Springs, which received the 2021 Texas Institute of Letters Carpe Collins Award, and he lives in Austin, Texas. So please join me in welcoming Joe Holley. This evening, we are especially happy to have our friend and also Trinity University Press author, David Martin Davies, in conversation with Joe. And with that, take it away, and thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Tom. And feel free to soak up as much air conditioning as you like, because just walking to your car is going to be a treacherous event. So, Joe Holley, it's so great to have you here today.
Thank you, Dave.
Talk about your book and your stories and your travels, and pulling it all together for us in this new book. The idea of a Native Texan and this collection of stories, and these are the kind of stories that seem to be the long chain molecules that make up Texas identity. And can you talk about like how these stories, you're part of your column work at the Houston Chronicle, but then again, you went through and you selected these. Just can you talk about that process?
Well, I am a Native Texan. I'm from Waco. Dave and I were talking earlier about how I wrote speeches for Ann Richards, and since both of us were from Waco, I had grown up hearing that Waco twang. So it was fairly easy to write speeches for Ann Richards. And I was telling Dave that when I wrote for her, I thought I was the greatest speech writer in the world. And then when she was defeated and I wrote for other people, I realized I was not the greatest speech writer in the world. But I have been intrigued my whole life by this place where we all live by the people, strange and interesting people. Tom mentioned that I was at the Washington Post, and when I was there, I taught a class at George Washington University, and I told one of my students that my unofficial beat was to write about eccentric Texans. And she said, "Mr. Holley, you sure must be busy." And she's right. But when I get out and about the state, small towns, even small communities within a place like San Antonio, I'm looking for people who have stories to tell. I'm looking for the personality of a place. And I'm looking for something about the past that has shaped the place and those particular people I'm talking to. I don't go out with a checklist saying, oh, here's one who's got people, past and place and so forth. But I realize afterward that's what I'm doing.
Can you talk about how you used to go out with your dad on his potato chip route
Right.
in Waco and how that kind of started all that?
Do y'all even know what a potato chip route would be? So we lived in Waco. My dad sold potato chips within, say, a 50-mile radius of Waco. And beginning, I think, when I was 5 or so, I would go with him during the summers and at Christmas holidays. And I think early on for the company that I would provide for him as he drove around to towns like Temple and Belton and Killeen and Rosebud and Cameron, I can tell you each stop every day. It would be a different set of towns every day of the week. But then as I got older, I became somebody who would really help him. And I began to notice that towns had personalities, and it was intriguing to me. I would try to imagine, here I lived in Waco, I would try to imagine what it would be like living in Temple and what the differences were. And I still find that interesting. I'm curious about how people put together a community. My wife Laura and I have a little house way out in West Texas called Marathon. Not Marathon. You all keep that in mind. It's Marathon, Dave. And it's a small town, maybe 400 people. And it's really interesting to watch this old town sort of being reborn with newcomers coming in, appreciating the past, but building something new and interesting in this little dried up West Texas town.
So outside of Marathon, do you have any other, there are some small towns in Texas that I've kind of mentally adopted, that I kind of keep an eye on them.
Have you been there, or you just...
No, it's just I've covered stories there.
Okay, right.
And it seemed like this is like Fremont, which is in Jim Wells County, just south of Alice and north of Falfurrias. And it's one of these small towns that it seems like it's just always something weird going on there. And Palestine, Texas, is another place where something horrible is always happening there. And
so that's what you're drawn to, right?
Yeah, my journalism. And it's like, oh, back to Palestine. So do you have some of these towns that just sort of stick with you?
Well, they stick with me for more positive reasons. This is San Antonio. There are towns like Marathon that I just mentioned that are still alive, because when I'm driving around the state, you all have had this experience too. You're driving around Texas and you come into small towns and they are dried up and they're blowing away. They're lucky if they have a courthouse to inject a little life into these places. But otherwise, it's the courthouse square and either abandoned buildings or the building that used to be the downtown drugstore or furniture store or whatever might be an antique store or a junk store. And there's not really a difference in these little places. So when I come upon a town that is a little town.
Sort of a Larry McMurtry Last Picture Show.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The wind blowing, the bus coming along to take you to the Korean War and all that. But when I find a town that has managed to avoid that dire fate, then I'm interested in it. How did this happen? A little town in the Panhandle called Canadian is one of them. And it's Canadian, for example, is so far north of Amarillo, that the nearest town of any size is Liberal, Kansas. And it's sort of hilly up there, despite what you think about the Panhandle. It's a beautiful little place.
And that's where they took a hit with the Smokehouse Creek fire.
The fires, that's right, yeah. And Canadian survives because people of some means have stayed and rooted themselves in their hometown, and they've got money, and they fix it up, keep it alive.
And, I'm sure many of us drive across Texas. And I had a job when I was at UT between semesters trying to make some money. And it was a road construction job. You go to the counties and you see how the county roads don't exactly match up. And so
that's because of you?
Well, the job was to try to make the county roads more sync up a little bit. So we would pave 8 feet of road, and then we'd drive across Texas to do the job someplace else.
They would follow fields, farm fields. That's why they were like that.
And so I drove a lot across Texas to do a little bit of work, and I get paid for that. But you just see the incredible state that we have, and the people there, and so it's baffling to see how you said this would be a great place to live if it wasn't here,
if it wasn't in Texas,
if it wasn't so far away from the shopping mall, right? And all that.
Well, I have to share with you a similar experience. Okay, my first real job, no, it was a summer job, actually, now that I think about it. But it was my first state job, was working for the Texas Highway Department, and it was to walk along I-35 between Waco and the town of West, picking up trash and dead animals in weather like this, outside. Yeah.
How'd that go for you? It made you want to study harder and learn how to write a little bit better.
My boss was a fellow named Rufus Cockrum, and he had been doing it for about 20 years, and he had 12 years to go. And all he would talk about was what he was going to do when he retired. And then he'd say, Joe, go to school, go to college. It's an experience.
So in your book, Native Texan, it's interesting, all the stories, these vignettes that you have about Texas, and trying to come up with a theme or a pattern, or it's almost very personal for you in this book. There's a lot of there's threads that come directly back to you. Was that deliberate?
Yeah, Tom mentioned the earlier book, Hometown Texas, that Trinity published. It's a beautiful book because it has photos by a Rice University photographer named Peter Brown. And he divided the state into 5 different sections, and he would have West Texas photos, North Texas, and so forth. They weren't illustrating the columns, but they were his notion of what that part of the state looked like, felt like. And I was doing the same thing with the columns. This one, as I was picking out columns that I wanted to include in the book, are a bit more personal. I just realized, I was talking to Laura earlier, after you've lived a certain amount of time, you become histories. It's like going into a museum and seeing an exhibit of mid-century modern furniture and realizing that's the couch I sat on, watching that little TV.
And so,
anyway, I'm not sure I answered your question.
And so talk a bit the connection to Bonnie and Clyde that's in the book.
I'm not quite that old, but I will tell you about the connection. Imagine that it's 1931, I think, and there's this young man walking on a cold winter day through a field, and he's got a shotgun in his hand, and his little boy is following behind him several steps. And he has 2 shotgun shells, and he's looking for either rabbits or squirrels to shoot because it's the Depression, and they are poor and they have nothing to eat. And he sees a couple of rabbits and misses. And so he goes back home with his little boy, Oh, this fellow I'm telling you about is named Joe as well, Joe Holley, in fact. He was my uncle. And he goes back to the house with nothing to eat, but that night he sneaks out and finds a couple of chickens at a neighbor's farm. And the family eats, but he gets caught and spends 100 days in the Hill County jail. This is an aside, but years later when my daughter and I were looking through old Hill County records, she was looking through one of those big ledgers at trials and so forth, and she said, Dad, I didn't know you'd been in jail. And it was the other Joe Holley. But while the original Joe Holley was in jail in Hillsborough, his fellow inmate was a fellow named Raymond Hamilton, this 22-year-old kid who was in there for being involved in the murder of a jewelry store owner in Hillsborough. And the deputy sheriff of Hill County one morning led a school group upstairs to the cell where Joe and Raymond Hamilton were being held, sort of an early scared straight, I guess. But somehow Raymond Hamilton got the lowdown on the sheriff, took his gun, took the kids back downstairs as if he were leading the the tour, ran across the street, stole the car ran out of gas, and he got caught again. Raymond Hamilton ended up being executed a year or so later because of an escape that Bonnie and Clyde engineered. Anyway, the story goes on. His brother was also a driver for Bonnie and Clyde, Floyd Hamilton. And years later, I discovered that Floyd was living in West Dallas. And I went to see him and told him I wanted to interview him. And he said, well, I'll think about it. Come back in a week. And I went back in a week, and Floyd Hamilton said, I will never talk to a newspaper guy, a reporter, again. And he explained that a young Dallas Morning News reporter had come by in the meantime. And he was telling her about how hard life was in Alcatraz, where he was held for years. And he told her that he got gum disease, pyorrhea. She heard a word that rhymes with pyorrhea. And that's what the Morning News read or wrote, and it irritated Mr. Hamilton. So I didn't get he didn't talk to me, and I didn't get the story. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to follow up on that.
Here's one quick way to follow up. That little boy who was following my Uncle Joe through the woods that morning, within 10 years, had become a Navy pilot flying over the Pacific in World War II and was shot down exactly like George Bush was shot down. And as he's in the water in the Pacific, there's an American Navy destroyer coming to rescue him, and there's a Japanese submarine coming to get him. And the Americans rescued him. So these are Texas stories.
Yeah, so that gets to the idea of, we have this Texas identity. It's very important to many of us. It's important to the state because, for marketing reasons,
right.
The Texas identity has become a commodity in many ways. Mm-hmm. You travel around the world and you tell people you're from Texas, mm-hmm. and they immediately, an eyebrow might shoot up, and they expect something from you about,
right. About your dress or whatever you're wearing. Yeah.
Yeah. And so how the Texas identity is fed by these types of stories, stories of independent rascals who will, might find some chickens in the middle of the night to keep the family fed, people who, challenge authority. But it's important now that as Texas is, dealing with its diversity, that we have stories that also reflect that as well. And it seems like in your book, Native Texan, you are inclusive in your story selection. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I'm trying to be, because I realized that the Texas history that I learned in 7th grade, Texas history, Crockett, Travis Bowie, and the icons, left out. I realized later, not in the 7th grade, left out a whole lot of Texans and a whole lot of great Texas stories, whether it's about women or African Americans or Hispanics or whoever. They're the stories that really need to be told, not only because they're interesting, but because they help us shape what this state really is, what it has been, and what it can be. And so I looked for stories, for example, like the one about Blas Payne, who was a Black Seminole. That's how he described himself. And the Black Seminole story is an amazing tale about these runaway slaves in Florida who got run out of Florida by Andrew Jackson, ended up in Oklahoma. They were afraid they were going to be enslaved in Indian territory, came through Texas into Mexico, came back to Texas to fight Indians with the U.S. Army, and their descendants still live out in West Texas. Blas Payne lived, you all probably remember Texas Agriculture Secretary Susan Combs, who has a ranch out near Marathon, and Blas Payne worked for her family. And
he was a hell of a cowboy.
He was a cowboy, yeah, and he was and just a character. Everybody knew him, respected him, and he's buried on the side of a mountain out close to Marathon.
So how did you get to that gravesite?
The gravesite is on Susan Combs' ranch right off a road, and it's on the other side of a barbed wire fence. And I drive by that gravesite up on the hill several times a week when we're out there. And finally, I was taking our dog Buddy to the park, and I decided to leave Buddy in the car, and I just sort of crawled under the barbed wire, hoping that Susan didn't have cameras out there, and read his tombstone.
So is that part of the job requirement? You got to be able to crawl on your belly like a reptile.
That's exactly right.
Get through barbed wire fence.
Yeah. And
to climb over fences.
That's
to
right.
get into oldest graveyards.
Yeah, particularly. Yeah, it seems like graveyards. I remember climbing over a fence on Houston's east side next to the ship channel, and this wasn't barbed wire. It was one of those how do you describe it? These iron,
wrought iron,
like
spears.
Yeah. So I got up over the fence. I had one leg on one side, one leg on the other, and I could imagine the headlines in my paper, the Houston Chronicle: elderly gentleman found pinioned on the cemetery fence, or arrested, or whatever. But it was okay.
What were you doing there?
I was looking for the guy who I thought was buried there, but he wasn't.
But his tombstone was there.
A monument was there. Okay. It was the guy for whom Harris County is named. Do y'all know? I didn't. I was a Houstonian. I didn't know. I think it was Richard Harris, or is that the movie star? Anyway, he's buried in New Orleans.
Not Kamala Harris.
Yeah, it wasn't her.
But so Harris was the person who founded Harrisburg.
Yeah, that's right.
Which became Houston.
That's right.
And so he came down with Moses Austin.
He came down, and he had boats that would run along the coast, I guess from Houston to New Orleans, and then down toward Veracruz.
So why would the person that Harris County, the most populous county in the state, one of the most prosperous counties in the state, why would his name become suddenly not even a trivia question? People don't even know the answer.
Yeah, I know it. I asked a local historian that, and he said, well, he was just a little ahead of his time or something. I didn't quite know what that meant, but that's what he said.
Well, he didn't live long enough to be in the Revolution.
He did not live long enough. He wasn't a soldier or an Indian fighter or something of that sort.
So is part of your job is collecting stories that are almost winked out of existence? Do you just catch them just in time, pull them out of the mist, and bring them back into the light?
Yeah, that's what makes the job fun, because there's so many of them like that.
And so, where do you usually turn to find these things?
Again, I think It has to do with having lived long enough that you know these stories, or you've heard these stories, or you've heard rumors of these stories, and you go check them out. And keep in mind that I'm a journalist, and one part of my beat is not necessarily eccentric Texans, but it is the past. It is history. I'm not a historian. I'm a journalist, and I go to places where I don't know the answer to these things. I want to know, and my notebook gives me license to be nosy and to ask questions. So it's things I vaguely know, or it's emails from people saying, hey, you ought to go to wherever.
And because you're a journalist, you're dealing with facts. These are not folk tales.
No, they're not folk tales, and they're not where you can find the best barbecue in Brady or whatever.
And so I'm really kind of mystified by the story of how the Marx Brothers got their start in Nacogdoches, Texas,
right.
Which is baffling because, the Marx Brothers are famously not from Texas.
They are not from Texas, for sure. You all realize that, right? Now, the Marx Brothers were on the burlesque circuit, and their mother, Minnie, was their manager, and they would make sort of the circuit through the South into Texas, and Nacogdoches was a fairly sophisticated town for.
Still is.
Yeah, it's a great place. It's a good town in the early 1900s, and so they were appearing in Nacogdoches, and their act had to do with little musical numbers, maybe little stories and things, and they had a full crowd on this Saturday in their theater, which is still there. But the crowd was not responding. And Groucho, I'm not sure they were named Groucho, Harpo, and all that at that point, but Groucho was really getting perturbed. And suddenly, the back doors open, and this fellow bursts in. He says, "A mule is loose." And the whole crowd gets up and leaves. Groucho and friends or brothers are just enraged. And so gradually the crowd filters back in. They got the mule corralled. He was rampaging down Main Street, but they finally got him caught. They come back in, and Groucho starts insulting the crowd. I can't remember. There's
the roaches of Nacogdoches.
Yeah, that's stuff like that. And his brothers were appalled because they were in Texas. And you know what happens to people who insult Texans. But to their shock and surprise, the audience is laughing hysterically. And that's when the Marx Brothers realized they were comedians, not musicians or whatever they were on that day. Nacogdoches.
So they went back to Brooklyn and put on the grease paint mustache and became the comedians. And we had to wait until the talkies came around.
Yeah, right.
But that was still part of the... Interesting how a mule in Nacogdoches
launched a career, right?
And gave us the horse feathers of the Marx Brothers.
Right.
So do you think Texas is unmined, for these gems? There's so many still out there.
It's a big place, and it's it's changing. And as we were discussing earlier, there are stories that we have ignored. So why not go find them? And that's my time may be passing, but that's a good thing to do.
So how long have you been at this then? Like you're
since
no,
I was
no longer a neophyte.
Since I was about 5, with the Chronicle since 13, but with earlier publications, it's the same thing I would do. Go out and find these stories.
And do you go to the barber, ask him, you know any good stories from around here? It seemed like to always
sometimes not necessarily a barber, but maybe Whataburger or something. Dairy Queen, just sit and listen and then introduce yourself.
And so in the collection, Native Texan, are you weaving together, I want to get back to this Texas identity thing because I'm fascinated by it because not only do we shape it, but it shapes us. Mm-hmm. And so are you, out of all the columns that you had to choose from, why these? What makes these ones stick out to you?
It's almost kind of a journalist mystical feel. You hear about something and you think, hey, that's a good story. Or you have lived or experienced something like your Uncle Joe getting thrown in jail with the Hamilton boy, that's a story that I think people would be interested in hearing, even though it's my story, but I think it's worth sharing.
So, we talk about Texas exceptionalism, and I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I remember. Do you remember the beer? It was called Texas Pride.
I've seen it. Yeah.
It was one of the worst beers you could buy. You were down to your last nickel, and it was like a near beer you'd get down, and I thinking like you slap Texas on a Pride on a product, and maybe you'll get some people to guzzle it down. Is despite the low quality of the product. And so there's some people who are willing to take advantage of things like that, and politicians aren't beyond that. I'm thinking of someone like Pass the Biscuits Pappy Daniel and others who are trying to exploit the Texas pride in order to get people to follow their beyond politicians to pander to people. Believe it or not, it does happen.
I've heard that. Yeah. Pappy O'Daniel's favorite song that he wrote
that he stole.
Beautiful. I'm thinking about the one, the boy who never got too old to comb his mother's hair.
Yes, and he supposedly wrote the "Beautiful, Beautiful Texas," which is like our state song, and which the melody, he would take the melody from another song,
and
he would write the words for it, and he became governor of Texas.
That's true.
With his hillbilly band, and then the worst senator to ever represent Texas.
But we got off on Pappy because he's another one of these interesting characters. But your question about Texas identity comes up all the time when I do things like this. Like, could you be the native Iowan and find the same kind of story? And I suppose you can, except Iowa is not quite as large and diverse as Texas. But it's an interesting question about what it is that makes this place unique, infuriating, unusual, and intriguing.
As you write these columns for the Houston Chronicle, you're also writing for their editorial page.
I do, right.
And do people not realize that it's the same person who's doing both of these things? They may rage at you for your, why don't you write editorials like those Native Texan columns?
Here's the way it goes, Dave. This is sort of a confession, I guess, but I do write editorials still. I'm basically retired, but I still write editorials every week. And over the years, I have gotten phone calls or emails, and somebody will say, Joe, you're the only reason I still subscribe to that, or your column is the only reason I still subscribe to that Houston comical rag. And every now and then, I can't help myself, but I'll say something like, do you know who writes those communist editorials? But that reminds me that I suspect my politics and the Chronicle's politics are not necessarily the politics that I encounter when I am talking to people in the Panhandle or West Texas or wherever. And yet, we find this common interest, which has to do with being Texan, with the past, with your particular town, with your own family stories. And politics is, for the most part, irrelevant.
Yeah, I mean, you get away from the political signs and things that people have up there, and you start talking to folk, and it all gets down to we all want the same things. But you talked earlier about how rural Texas is really suffering right now. Their healthcare, rural hospitals have closed in Texas faster, more of them than any other state. There's all sorts of problems with, you've written about how in this other book you've got here about the history of bringing electric power to rural parts of Texas using the co-op movement, which was communist, socialist.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, socialist.
But it was a big part of improving the lives of so many in rural parts of Texas. And so you have to wonder, why is rural Texas being left behind?
I suppose the easy answer is that small towns can't find ways to keep their young people. They have to go away. And I think we were hoping maybe that the pandemic, where people had to stay home to work, proved that you could work from your small town instead of having to move to Houston or Dallas or San Antonio. But they're still struggling unless they're within the penumbra of Austin, San Antonio, or Dallas, Fort Worth. There's no reason to be there. And what's interesting about this book that Dave and I have talked about before is that these were rural people who 50 years after the city of San Antonio, for example, had electricity, they were still living with coal oil lamps, and they could not get electricity until they banded together and insisted that the power companies come out to the farms and ranches.
But it took the federal government.
It did, right.
And Lyndon Johnson also, and he lived with the lack of electricity.
That he did, right.
Growing up. And so, the editorial writing, the idea of Texas independence, Texas rugged individualism, I mean, it can only get you so far. Coming together in these co-ops to do electric power, getting everyone to pitch in a little bit of money in order to get the stake to bring electricity to these far-off rural places. Not actually that far off nowadays.
True.
But, we could do the same thing in broadband. If we were able to bring broadband to these areas, then they might be able to have affordable, reliable broadband.
Hospitals, schools, all kind of things.
And they people could work from home, work from there. They, and able to build websites and do all sorts of work.
Right.
So this type of work still is necessary.
Absolutely, and it reminds me. You all here in San Antonio probably remember Ted Fehrenbach, the historian who wrote the definitive history of Texas. He and I had lunch one time at the Argyle. It's my one and only time to go to the Argyle. And I asked Ted one question, and it took him from drinks to dessert to answer it. It was fascinating, but I didn't have to ask any other question. But he was telling me about mythical Texans, those Texans that we consider the icons. And to him, they were the Alamo heroes, and they were cowboys. And we have sort of formed who we are based on our notions of who they were. And maybe sometimes we didn't quite get those characteristics, their individuality, their toughness. Maybe somehow we've exaggerated that, and we've forgotten the fact that they did cooperate with each other to build a life on the frontier. And we need to remember that, it seems like.
But, I mean, we didn't really actually know these individuals ourselves.
Uh-huh.
We are dependent upon storytellers and the movies and Gunsmoke and these things like that to tell us, under the Rifleman, to give us this idea of what Texas was, and where our identity comes from. And that's looking through the funhouse mirror into this, and so many things are exaggerated and so many things are left out. So, are we able to make that correction? I don't know if you ever saw this, the Texas history movies, was like a comic book that we were given as kids.
Absolutely. I remember that well. Yeah.
And it told us the story of Texas. It was produced by the oil companies to
and
give us to all the kids in school to give us this is the official version of Texas, our history and where we came from. And of course it was, had a lot of racist tropes in there. And that's still the history of Texas that's being regurgitated over and over again.
Well, and but this is what we talked about earlier, that there are these stories out there about other Texans that are not only fascinating, but worth finding and worth telling.
So now we've reached the time where we're going to open it up for questions from our audience. And we have a microphone that we can pass around. And anyone has a question or a comment for Joe Holley, we'd love to hear it about his book, Native Texan. And he will also be around to sign copies and sell copies after the program. But so in this collection, I will wait for someone to. Am I missing anybody? No. Okay. All right. Hey.
Hey. Joe Holley, it's always good to see you.
Thank you.
Got to run off in a little bit because the other great storyteller, Bill Clinton, is on TV in a few minutes.
I've heard that, yeah.
And our sheriff just spoke on national TV.
Oh, good.
He just spoke about the 53 immigrants that passed.
Yeah.
But in your story here, I'm sure there were stories that your editor said, we can't put that in. Would you relate one of those to us so that you could not put in?
I can't think of one. I don't think that happened. I sort of wish it did, so I could say.
Okay, well, thank you very much. This is I've sped read it already. It's a good read. Take multiple readings, but thank you very much for the stories. However, I sort of feel like some of the issues around this new theme park they're making in Alamo Plaza, the Manifest Destiny theme park. Can you give us some ideas why there's not enough of the real stories in your book about the Alamo?
So I have written probably 3 or 4, George, about the Alamo over the years, and I think the last one was one weekday morning. I decided to go to one of those. I can't remember what it was called. The Scary House over there.
Yeah, the old like Ripley's, believe it or not, and
next door to Ripley's. Yeah. And so here's this fellow of a certain age waiting to buy his ticket to go through the Scary House. There were a few little kids and their mothers and me. I try not to look suspicious, but I just wanted to see what it was like, and then I wrote a column about it as a way to get into what the Alamo story is and how it too is much more diverse, much more interesting, much bigger than is known by most Texans and certainly people beyond Texas.
But people defend the Alamo's myth as hard as the defenders of the Alamo defended the Alamo. But you have to wonder, like, what are we defending? Why is it so hard to, issue the corrections that?
And I don't know the answer to that question. Yeah.
Well, it's because it's critical to the Texas identity. And the Texas identity provides a permission structure for many people in the state to do what it is that they do.
I suppose, but the story is so much more interesting, it would seem like, when you incorporate the whole story.
Well, that depends. Or the story, it's like my family was here. They settled Texas. I'm a daughter of the Texas Republic, and therefore I have privilege. That's something that people value and they want to protect.
Well, you don't have to get rid of it, right?
Well, people, the scarcity breeds value, and so that's what they want.
Yeah,
they want to feel like they have a special entitlement to the story of Texas.
Right.
So I feel like the history of Texas is too important to leave to the hands of the government, and that we should have more storytellers like you going out there and telling about the diversity of the people that made Texas the state that it is today.
Yeah, and you don't have to make a big effort. The stories are out there, and they're fun to find.
Anyone else have any questions or comments you want to? Okay. All right.
Hey. How you doing, Bob?
I had a couple of questions. I haven't read your book yet. I have bought it.
Just good.
But from
you can read it in pieces. That's why it's good.
Okay. Yeah, like you distribute it in the paper, right?
Right.
From the examples you've given, they seem to be about rural Texans,
Uh-huh.
first of all. Do you also cover urban Texas? I mean, it's the state's now, 70%
Yeah,
urban.
exactly. Right.
I mean, it's not reflected in the political people we have. It's all rural still, but the state is. So there seems to me to be a lot of stories there. In Houston, I mean, you could spend the rest
Very
of
much so.
your
Right.
career on it. And then, secondly, how about different ethnic groups and African Americans,
Yeah.
women? You know,
That's
Mexican.
yeah. That's what Dave and I were alluding to. That those are the stories that have been ignored. And there's when you read the book, you'll find some of those in here. Your question about rural urban is interesting, and I'm guessing that I'm sort of drawn to the small towns because they're kind of self-contained, and you can tell their stories easily, as opposed to telling the story of San Antonio or Dallas or Houston. But once you get into San Antonio and find discrete communities and interesting people, I mean, those stories are worth telling as well.
Yeah, clearly in San Antonio.
Yeah.
West Side, South Side, whatever, East Side, you have very, very different kinds of stories.
Right.
And there's also parts of San Antonio that used to be very rural, parts of Houston that
Very
used
much
to be,
so, right,
and have
right.
been consumed by urban sprawl. These small towns that used to exist or have been paved over.
Subsumed into big cities. Bob and I worked together years ago traveling the state, so he knows the state as well as I do. So send me some ideas.
I mean, didn't your mom come from a small town that used to be outside of San Antonio?
He still is.
Okay.
My mom was the 1932 valedictorian of Bigfoot High School and a star volleyball player for the Bigfoot Cathounds.
So let's talk about.
Thanks, Bob.
Bob, did you want to talk about Bigfoot a little bit more? Not the mystical creature, but the other Bigfoot Wallace.
Yeah, Bigfoot Wallace is interesting because he is sort of the archetypal frontiersman. Did you know that when Disney was looking for a frontier hero in the early 50s, he came up with 4 candidates. One was Daniel Boone, one was Johnny Appleseed, one was Davy Crockett, one was Bigfoot Wallace. Bigfoot Wallace is interesting because he got here as a 19-year-old to avenge the death of a brother and a cousin at Goliad. And he hated Texas, and yet he stayed here from age 19 until he died in 1899, and he became sort of the archetypal frontier Texan. He was everywhere. He was an Indian fighter. He was a Texas Ranger. He was a scout. He was a mail carrier from San Antonio to El Paso and so forth. And as I say, my mother grew up in Bigfoot, which is it's 40 miles south of here, just right off I-35 near Divine. And I would go to San Antonio with my brothers in the summer to visit my grandmother. And we would ride the train from Waco to San Antonio. And I remember it was the Katy, the Texas Special. And the train would pull into the station, but it wouldn't stop. And it would go on down to where the stockyards are. Were, yeah. And then back up into the station. And our aunt and uncle would be there to pick us up to take us on to Bigfoot. My grandmother ran the one and only general store in Bigfoot, and her best friend was the post mistress. The post office was across the street, and people would come in the mornings to pick up their mail, and then they would walk over to her store to have a chaw of tobacco or a Coke or whatever. And her store had this long porch with benches, wooden benches, and they would sit on those benches and tell stories. And I would sit on the edge of the porch with my foot down in the dirt in the little parking lot and listen to those stories. And maybe some of them were about Bigfoot Wallace. I don't know, because Lizzie Thomas, the postmistress, her family took care of Bigfoot in his final days. And so I would listen to those stories, even then, and they were fascinating. Whether they were true then, I don't know, but they were interesting.
Well, they were entertaining. We had another question.
Hey, Joe.
Hey, Steve.
Good to see you.
Thank you.
And So I haven't read the book yet. I'm excited about it, of course. And so I don't know if you included the story of your perilous journey down the Brazos River, retracing the paddle strokes of John Graves.
Steve and I barely survived.
I think I was okay in my canoe, but
It's in there, yeah.
Okay. Oh, it is good for you.
Yeah,
great.
Good.
So the question I want to ask is, we've talked about Canadian before, we've talked about marathon before, and like you, I'm kind of fascinated by this idea of what can make rural Texas work. What can make a town actually succeed that's not in the megalopolis orbit. And the commonalities between Canadian and marathon are that they have these wealthy patrons who basically fund the town. And so I'm curious, do you see any other model that could actually work here in Texas?
I wrote a Texas Monthly story trying to answer that question, and I found Canadian, Marathon, and Albany, close to Abilene, that relied on those wealthy local folks who stayed, or at least they kept their money in those towns. And I was hoping that wasn't the only model. And I think I have found another model in Marathon. Even though Marathon has a wealthy patron, it also has a group of young people who have sort of not necessarily adopted Marathon, but they've moved in. And they are running the local grocery store, which is the town's clean, well-lighted place. It's the gathering place. And they are sort of working with each other to make this town a prosperous little place, not to become Marfa necessarily. Marathon calls itself the un-Marfa, but to make it a welcoming place where people can make a living. So, Steve, maybe that's another model, I hope, anyway.
Well, I know a model that's probably not good for these rural areas, and that's
You always find these negative things.
Well, I'm a news guy, and so I'm thinking about, the school vouchers, and that's something that people in rural Texas, they do not want school vouchers. They know the number one employer in most of these counties is the local public school system.
Right.
And so the idea of pulling money out of the school system for, school vouchers was not really going to benefit rural Texas. I mean, that's going to be hard.
It's I wrote a story about Fort Davis out in the Big Bend area too, and how vouchers, as planned, would destroy that little school if people took advantage of them. And there's no place to use those vouchers out there. And in those little towns, as you all probably know from your own experience with small towns, the schools are the lifeblood of towns. Not only are the largest employer, but that's where things happen. The 6-man football or basketball or whatever.
And you're still writing these columns?
They're not regular anymore. It's whenever I find something.
And most of your ideas, a lot of them come from tips and questions.
Yeah. Steve might call me, for example, and tell me about Castroville or something.
Yeah, and so. Are you see yourself as a documentarian, capturing something that needs that otherwise would not?
I hadn't thought of that, but yeah, I hope so.
Well, it's quite an accomplishment.
Thank you.
As a native Texan, I have to ask. Are there some indigenous stories in there about indigenous people? How far back do you go as a native Texan?
I'm trying to think. I go far back, but I can't remember. There's not any. I don't think there's any indigenous stories in this collection, but I'm always looking.
Okay, all right.
I just thought of one actually.
Okay, tell us.
Yeah,
tell us that
indigenous
story.
like 10,000 years ago, the painted rocks out in far west Texas, those cultures, those civilizations that we don't know nearly enough about. That's one.
Okay. Well, I'm just curious because as a native Texan,
right,
generations that go back probably 1,000 years, I just want to point that out to the people here that
I'm glad you brought it up.
You're the new guys.
That's right.
Yes.
You're exactly right.
Right. So things like the White Shaman panel, many people are maybe familiar with that. And then there's all these other Waco tanks, paintings, lots of pre-Columbian
rock art.
These are mystical, important religious items that were as more accurate interacting with the solar system than Stonehenge.
Right.
So the people that painted these items had a very highly developed awareness of mathematics and astronomy. But the problem is that so much of this is on private land.
Mm-hmm.
And that, and it's almost as if Texas doesn't want to recognize or celebrate the fact that we have so much of this of this native painting around us that that otherwise should be
and
really just part of, when you say the Texas identity, that should be part of the Texas identity.
And I think the Whitty Museum here in town has a relationship with those landowners and have helped them understand why cooperating and exposing these valuable things are worth their while as well.
And they're priceless, and they add to the mystery of Texas and how this is a land that has been lived on by sophisticated peoples for thousands and thousands of years.
Right. We are the newcomers.
Right. And so I think that this Texas identity that's been ginned up by this white hierarchy is in order to create the permission system to believe that nothing was here before their arrival.
Right. Yeah.
And so, so the stories that you have and you document and you provide and you promote, it's a valuable service.
I hope so. Right.
And so, and I want to thank you for that.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks for the questions.
All right. And without any other questions, we're going to wrap this shindig up. All right. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.